voice17104.com. This is Zanetta Wingfield, and you're listening to the voice17104.com. The voice17104.com.
Welcome, my brothers and sisters, to the Richard James Show on 17104, The Voice. Greetings, my friends, and salutations. We're back again, the Richard James Show, and we're going to deal with issues that pertain to the African American community. And we have an icon that we're going to listen to today, a woman by the name of Angela Davis. And if you know anything about Black history, then you know Angela Davis. Angela Davis was sort of the queen of the civil rights movement back in the 60s. She was in prison. It's a whole detailed situation that we found that the FBI had almost tried to create a case against her, and she went into court, and eventually she won the case. She's Dr. Angela Davis. She's a professor emeritus at the University of California, but she has some very strong views. And we have another guest, a surprise guest, a Caucasian lady who has some of the most in-depth knowledge about the freedom struggle of African Americans in our history, of anyone who happened to be Caucasian that I've had a chance to talk or listen to. I've never met her, but she is absolutely brilliant in her presentation. Let's kind of talk a little bit about Miss Angela Davis. Angela Davis was born in Birmingham, Alabama, in the heart of Dixie, in the South. She has a sister that's well known. She also has a brother. She had a very, very active family. But her sister was named Fania Davis. And Fania was a friend of mine back in the day. Fania was a student at Swarthmore College back in the early 60s. She went on to complete her education and became an attorney, a lawyer, but she was a brilliant woman, beautiful woman. And she continued to lead the movement to free Angela. When Angela was being pursued by the FBI, eventually accosted and arrested and jailed. And she led the movement nationally to free Angela, in a movement that was very successful overall. Now, this is a very long video, and it's into a whole number of topics. And we're not going to try to cover this in our video, but we're going to show some things, and then we're going to analyze some things. Let me do some clarification concerns that I had. I've been watching other things on YouTube, and it seems that anybody can put anything on YouTube. And they had a gentleman who claimed to be Native American and said a lot of things that were absolutely not true. I don't know if he made it up or somebody told him that. And he indicated that people on Bedford Island, off the coast of South Carolina, were not African. And he said they're Native American. He's a little bit confused as to what a native of anything is. Native is original or aboriginal. And that doesn't necessarily mean that's where you started from. For example, the Aborigines of Australia, the first people of Australia, they didn't originate in Australia, they originated in Africa. Clarify. Man, and I've said it over and over again, mankind began in Africa. White, black, yellow, some of those issues will be discussed in this video. We need to clarify that. We need to tell the truth. I have Native American in my background. My grandfather, according to family, heritage was half Indian. They thought he was Cherokee, but with the genealogical research that my daughters come up with, it appears that he was not Cherokee at all, but the Sioux. And there's a whole historical significance of what happened with the Sioux when they were taken in by the Cherokee Indian Nation. But black people, original black people, been here for hundreds and hundreds of years. The first known African were the Mandingo people under Mansa Musa years and years ago. This gentleman was trying to prove that they're not African. Well, he's wrong. He's dead wrong. He's just as African as he can be. He can say anything he wants, but his genes speak for himself. All right. Well, this is just some things, and some of these things are covered in this dialogue between Angela Davis, professor, vice professor. Okay, let's roll it. Let's get into the video. Some of these answers will become clear.
Yeah, we need to know whether somebody has a gun. You think I'm kidding? I know, I'm in Texas, y'all.
Okay, so the first question is for Angela Davis, and then I'll invite commentary from Jane Elliott. Angela, on the web, you're quoted as saying, racism is a much more clandestine, much more hidden kind of phenomena, but at the same time, it's perhaps far more terrible than it's ever been. Would you explain what you meant by that and why this conversation on race and social justice is still necessary?
I'm trying to remember when I said that. It may have been 30 years ago.
Do you believe it?
First of all, thank you very much for inviting me. I'd like to thank the, is the mic working? Okay. I'd like to thank the, no?
Who cannot hear? If you cannot hear, raise your hand.
Okay, is this better? All right, well, I'll hold it up to my mouth. So first of all, I'm really honored to be here with Jane Elliott. This is the first time I've had the opportunity to meet her. And I'm very happy that the students initiated this series on social justice. So that question regarding a comment I probably made during the period when people were talking about a post-racial America. Do you remember that?
Last week.
It wasn't that long ago. And I was probably responding to those who were arguing that racism was something of the past, that with the so-called triumph of the civil rights movement, we had overcome racism. It may have been during the time Obama was in office, because there was the assumption that the election of one black man to the White House magically eradicated, all of the consequences of racism and settler colonialism for the last 500 years. And so the question as to whether I believe that it is hidden today, yes. There are manifestations of racism that are certainly overt, thanks to the person who occupies the highest rung of executive office in this country. But I would say that I don't know whether we grasp the extent to which racism has affected and infected the entire history of this country. It's not a simple thing. We cannot wish it away. We cannot simply assume that by doing all kinds of trainings, and trainings are really important, and I totally appreciate the value of bringing people to consciousness about the way in which they are responsible for the perpetration and perpetuation of racism. But racism is deeply ingrained in the economy, in the school system, in the prison system, criminal justice. And I would probably conclude by saying what we are addressing today are issues that should have been taken up in the immediate aftermath of slavery. But they're also issues that should have been taken up with respect to the colonization of this part of the world. The first victims of racism were indigenous people in this country. And so that means we have a lot of work ahead of us.
Right. Okay. Jane, you want to comment?
You want me to comment?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Sure do.
You don't really want me to comment because I'm really angry. I want you folks to do something. I want every white person, every person in this room who considers himself or herself a member of the white race to stand right now. Right now. Every person in this room who considers himself or herself a member of the white race. Now, remain standing. Now, remain standing. Now, will every person in this room who considers himself or herself a member of the black race please stand? Up, 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 up. And remain standing. Now, the brown race. Anybody who considers himself or herself a member of the brown race. Now, the yellow race. Now, the red race. Now, will look around you, people. Practically everybody is standing. Now, will every person in this room who considers himself or herself a member of the human race please sit down? Now, people, you are all members of the same race, the human race, which started with black women between 300,000. Don't interrupt me, I don't have much time. Now, white folks, you don't like it, but all you are is faded blacks. That's the way it is. Every one of you, if you trace your DNA back far enough, you're going to find that some of your DNA came from Africa, because we all have the same ancestor back there, every single one of us. And those of you who think you don't have are obviously from outer space. Now, that means that every one of us is a 30th to 50th cousin to every other person in this room. So I want you to turn to the person on your left or your right or behind or in front of you, stick out your hand and say, "Hi, cousin."
Hi, cousin.
Now, will every person in this room who considers himself or herself a biracial person stand? Don't you stand. Don't you stand. People, we have to get rid of the language of racism. Words are important, people. Words matter. You have to be careful how you use them, and you have to refuse to tolerate these ugly words being used in your presence. Now, make no mistake about this. I've been described as a teacher. I'm not a teacher. Teachers dispense facts and figures so that they can get their kids ready for the end of school testing. I've been called a trainer. You train dogs and horses and members of the military. I don't train people. I'm an educator. The word educator, I don't want to be interrupted anymore. People, the word educator comes from the root duck, deuce, which means lead, the prefix E, which means out, the suffix ate, which means the act of, and the suffix or, which means one who does. An educator is one who is engaged in the act of leading people out of ignorance. Now, in this country, we spend a lot of money on what we call education. It isn't education, it's indoctrination. It takes us 13 years to teach a student, to educate a student, to be ignorant about race, and to support ideas that make this a better country. This is a word for this in my vernacular, since I was raised on a farm, is bullshit. Don't write that down. People, I recognize it when I see it, and that's what we're living with right now. If we were in post-racial society, Donosaurus T. Rump would not be in the White House. He got elected because white people resented having a black man in the White House for 8 years. It's time to face the truth and say the truth, and it's time for women, and all people of color to stop playing defense and defending what they are and go on the offense. We were here first. We don't have to apologize for what we are or for what we do. Now, I know some of you are thinking, boy, is she a bitch? Yes, I am. Now, how many of you women have been called the B word? Look around, fellas. Everybody's heard it. Come up with a new word. Now, how many of you are called that by a male? All right, people, for me, the B word is an acronym for being in total control, honey. And when women are seen in control, the men around them call them the B word. You need to say, you're right, darling, I am. And then you need to whip out your little Lorena Bobbitt fruit knife. Now, don't do that, because some of these boys are scared to death. Now some of you are thinking, she doesn't like men. Oh, God, do I like men. Oh, Find me one, please, please. Some of my best friends are men. I was married to one for 59 years. When I married him, he looked just like Marlon Brando. He really did. When he died, he looked like Telly Savalas. Lived with me for 59 years. Now, what's your next question? Sorry.
Okay.
Education should be fun.
I'm already cutting out questions. Okay. Let's talk about privilege.
Angela, you want to talk about privilege?
And this goes to you, Jane, first. How did you first become aware? This is a reflective question. How did you first become aware of your own privilege? And how did you first become aware that others had more privilege than you? And I'm going to ask the same of you also.
Oh, you want me to go first?
So you go first.
I never thought of it as white privilege. I just thought if you do the right thing, people will do the right thing where you're concerned. And because I'm white, they did. And they were wrong. Because I've been doing the wrong thing for about 33 years, I did the wrong thing. I thought I was all right. And then I did the blue-eyed, brown-eyed exercise. And I watched a brilliant little blue-eyed white girl turn into a frightened, intimidated, unable to learn child in the space of 15 minutes because I accused her of not being smart enough because she had the wrong color eyes. And I watched 4 dyslexic brown-eyed boys read words they had never been able to read and spell words they had never been able to spell because nobody had ever told them that they could learn to read or spell. But on the day they had brown eyes, it was obvious that the world was theirs. They could do anything. I found out about expectations that day, and I realized that what we have done, what we white folks have done in this country, ever since we got here, is treat people positively or negatively, not on the basis of the color of their skin, but on the basis of our ignorance about skin color, where it comes from and what it causes. This is not about skin color, this is about ignorance. And the answer to ignorance is education. It is not indoctrination, it is not schooling, it is not training, it is education. But you have to have teachers who know better if they're going to teach better. And teachers can only teach what they know. And unfortunately for all of us, we've all been led down the same ugly path of thinking that it's all right to claim privilege when what we should be claiming is ignorance. We've got the wrong word here, people. This problem is white ignorance. And white people are running the show. Now you're going to think she's a traitor to her race. I'm not a traitor to the human race, and that's the only race I see. Make no mistake about that. And as long as we keep on acting as though there are several races, we can have panels like this at which we discuss white privilege instead of discussing white ignorance and deciding to do something about it. We need to start really furnishing education in these schools instead of furnishing indoctrination. Did that answer your question?
Yes, partially.
All right.
The rest of the question is, so how did you become aware of your own privilege or of others having more privilege than you? You're talking about...
I watched my students.
It was watching the
And
students.
I realized, watching them, that they were exhibiting the behaviors that they were copying from me. They acted hey, my little brown-eyed students, the day they were on the top in that exercise, became me. And it made me sick to my stomach, and it does to this day. I hate to remember that day, because I watched my brown-eyed children we just loved one another in my classroom. We really did. And on that day, I found out that I don't want to be tolerated. Because in that classroom, my kids tolerated me because I'm blue-eyed. The first thing that was said after I told the kids that blue-eyed people aren't as smart as brown-eyed people, a little brown-eyed child in the front row, Debbie Hughes, looked up at me and said, "How come you're the teacher here if you got them blue eyes?" I got a real experience that day, and a real educational experience, people. I found out how I look to people of color. And I have spent the last 50 years trying not to look like that and trying to encourage others to stop it. Tell you another thing. Do I have a few more minutes here? My father, at the age of 60, watched the film that the CBC made in my classroom the second year I did the exercise. They sent me a copy of it, and I showed it to my father and my mother. My father was 60 years old, the most honest man, the most moral man I've ever known. I showed him that film. When it was over, he stood up, and in his bib overalls and his blue chambray shirt rolled up to the elbows, he reached in his back pocket, took out his red handkerchief, and with tears in his eyes, he blew his nose and said, "I wish somebody had taught me that when I was 9 years old." You can criticize what I do until the cows come home. And psychologists do until they get smart. I don't listen anymore because my father said, "I wish somebody had taught me that when I was 9 years old." If somebody had taught my father that when he was 9 years old, we would never have had to listen to some of the ridiculous racist remarks that he made. And he never made them again after he watched that film. Don't tell me that you can't change people. Don't tell me that you're too old to change. There isn't a person in this room who is too old to change. White folks, you gotta change. Because within 30 years, you will be a numerical minority in the United States of America. And you had better pray to whoever you pray for, that people of color are not going to get even with us and treat us the way we have treated them. If you can't think of any other reason for treating people like equal human beings, think of that one. Because what you do today is creating the future. I don't think you want the kind of future that you have provided for people in the present. I may be mistaken. You may not know what's going on. You know what's going on. And if I asked you, every white person in this room who wants to be treated the way we have treated people of color in this country, if you'd like to be treated that way, all you white folks, if you want that for the rest of your life, please stand. Did you understand the directions? If you're white and you think blacks have got it so good in this country and you want to be treated the way they have been for the rest of your life, just stand up. You know why you aren't standing. You know it's ugly, and you know it's happening, and you know you don't want it to happen to you. So I want to know why you're so willing to allow it for others in this post-racial society.
Thank
Another
you.
question?
Okay, so we're talking about privilege and how you first became aware that others had more privilege than you, and how you might have been aware that you had more privilege than others.
First of all, I think it is important to emphasize the notion of privilege, but privilege, as Jane pointed out, can't explain the workings of racism altogether.
That's right.
Okay, so make that
So-
distinction. That's really important.
Well, do you want me to tell you when I first
Yes,
became
do that.
aware
Yes,
of
yes.
racism?
Yes, yes.
I had the, I don't know whether I would say good fortune or bad fortune, of growing up in the most segregated city in the United States of America during the 1940s and the 1950s, Birmingham, Alabama. And so I can't really tell you when I became aware of racism. I think that as I learned to think and learned to conceptualize, racism was always in the forefront. I can tell you that I remember when I was about 2 years old, I was washing my shoelaces, my white shoelaces, because I was going to wear them to Sunday school the next day. It was a Saturday evening. And then suddenly, I heard this sound, this thunderous sound. As it turned out, the house across the street was being bombed by the Ku Klux Klan. Because I lived in an area of Birmingham that was right on the edge of the zone that had been created for black people. So we were able to live on one side of the street, white people on the other side of the street. When black people bought a house on the other side of the street, it was bombed by the Ku Klux Klan. But let me say something parenthetically here, because you might ask, well, how is it that black people were able to buy a house in the white neighborhood? Because of course white people would have to sell it to them. It was because white people bought the house. White people who were involved in the anti-racist movement bought the house so that black people could challenge the racial zoning laws. This was in Birmingham, Alabama. You might have heard of Ann Braden from Louisville, Kentucky, who was one of my mentors. I met her when I was very, very young. And she and her husband, Carl, ended up doing the same thing in Louisville. They bought a house for a black couple. Carl ended up going to the federal penitentiary as a result, because he was charged with some incredible charge. But the point that I want to make is that, when I learned how to think, I learned how to think about racism. And I was very fortunate to be raised by a mother who was a teacher. My father was a teacher as well. And I would like to say an educator
yes.
in the way you
Absolutely,
described
yes.
what it means to be an educator. Because as I've said many times, from the moment when I became aware of the fact that black people were treated as inferior, I can remember hearing my mother's voice say, "This is not the way things are supposed to be. This is not the way the world is supposed to be organized. And one day they will be different." So as a result, I learned how to imagine a different world early on. When I was, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 years old. And I have, it wasn't so much a personal awareness. And I think that oftentimes we tend to only think about racism in personal terms. That there's, something wrong with this white person because this white person has racist ideas. But it's about ideology. It's about how larger forces are doing the work through our emotion and our consciousness, and the fact that during that period, so many white people, not all, but the vast majority of white people were convinced that black people were inferior. It had something to do with the way in which we conceptualize freedom. I mean, how did white people know that they were free? During slavery, this was supposed to be the first great democracy in the world. How did people who experienced that democracy know that they were free? Because they looked at slaves and they were able to say, I am free because I am not a slave. I am free because I am not black. I am free because I am not in prison. So I think that it's really important to ask ourselves how these larger forces, how the state, how racist ideology works through individuals. And oftentimes people assume that it's their ideas. It's not their ideas. They have been infected before they even, oftentimes before they even acquire the ability to think, they think in a racist way. And that has to do with larger forces. I've always been interested in how these forces connect. So when we speak about racism, it's not just anti-black racism. It's racism that affects, all of the communities, Latinx communities, indigenous communities, Asian American communities, Muslim communities. But it's also about the relationship between racism and class exploitation. And it's about the relationship between racism and misogyny, and racism and transphobia. So the term that we often use now, intersectional, which means to try to think these things together and ask, how they reinforce each other and how they create modes of oppression that are especially violent and dangerous. Perhaps the people in this country who are the community that is most subject to violence, both state violence, institutional violence, and also individual violence, would probably be trans women of color. Right. And so I think, oftentimes when we're in institutions such as universities, we're taught to isolate and analyze. And we forget that when we engage in these processes of isolating a concept for the purpose of understanding it, we forget that this is not the way the real world works. We assume that what's in our head constitutes social reality. But social reality is very messy. It's not the kinds of, as someone who has been a teacher at the university level for many, many years, 20 years or so training PhD candidates, I can tell you that the hardest thing to teach is the difference between the tools that we use to try to learn how to understand the world and the way the world exists in its craziness and messiness. The social world always exceeds our ability to fully comprehend it. And I think that if we don't recognize that, we will never move in the direction of revolutionary change, which is what we need in this country right now and in this world.
I'd like to ask
Well-
the audience a question. May I?
Oh, let me follow up with
Okay.
her, and then I'll come back to you. I'm doing this on behalf of the students who organize this event because the word privilege is something they specifically want you to address. You said you'd made a distinction between racism and privilege. How does privilege fit in to what you're talking about?
Well, I mean, I think white privilege is an important concept. And in a sense, it comes from W.E.B. Du Bois and his notion of the wages of whiteness. The wages, the metaphorical wages that you are paid simply because you are white. Or someone like Cheryl Harris, who writes about whiteness as property. Whiteness as a kind of valuable property. Or Peggy McIntosh, who, of course, writes about privilege as being a kind of invisible knapsack that white people carry that has all kinds of codes and ways of maneuvering in the world that give them a great deal more privilege than others. But privilege is also something that one can discover in communities of color.
Yes.
I think about what's his name in the White House now? I try really hard to forget his name. But I was watching one of his, I don't know why I was watching one of his speeches. I really don't. But what struck me was that there is always a black person sitting right behind him. Have you noticed that? There's always a black person, and that black person holds up a sign saying "Blacks for Donald Trump" or something ridiculous like that. The point that I want to make is that black people are also implicated in the way racism works.
Yes.
Particularly when one considers that now more than ever before, there are black people at in the corporate world. I mean, the thing I didn't speak about was capitalism. And the origins of racism within capitalism and the way capitalism has always been racial capitalism. When we speak about capitalism, we should say racial capitalism. And therefore, white workers who are clearly exploited and oppressed by the capitalist system should recognize that until we purge our planet of racism, there will be no way to move beyond this exploitative way of providing the things that people need, all over the world. And I'll say, why is it that production happens, economic production happens, not because we as human beings, and we are all one, as Jane pointed out, have needs, and we need to eat, and we need clothing, and we need chairs, and all of these things. But it happens in order to provide profit for a relatively small number of people in the world. The wealthiest 8 men, because they're all men, on the planet own more than half of the entire world. And that is obscene. That is absolutely obscene. And that has a great deal to do with racism. It has a great deal to do with misogyny and all of the other modes of and it's certainly about privilege. That's the ultimate privilege, I would say. And I'll be quiet. I'm going to stop preaching. Right.
Hear you. They came to hear you. You wanted to say something.
Today, I asked a young woman how long she thinks this has been going on, this racism against blacks. How long do you think it's been going on? Forever? You're wrong. 500 years.
Yeah.
During the Spanish Inquisition, the people who were running the Spanish Inquisition and killing people because of their religion found out that they killed a whole lot of people who had the right religion. They couldn't tell what their religion is by looking at them. So they decided they had to find another way to identify the people that they were going to kill and enslave, and/or enslave. So they set upon skin color. People, it's only 500 years old. Now think of that. It's only 500 years old. Nobody was born a racist. There is no gene for bigotry. You were not born a racist. You have to be taught to be a racist, and you have to be carefully taught. And if you haven't seen that musical, in which the last song is, you have to be taught to be afraid of people whose skin is a different shade, of people whose eyes are differently made. You have to be carefully taught.
South Pacific.
Yes, South Pacific. You have to be taught before it's too late, before you are 6 or 7 or 8, to hate all the people your relatives hate. You have to be carefully taught. And that's what we have to do in this country to keep this racism alive. If we want racism to stop, we have to stop teaching racism. In our homes, in our churches, people, Jesus did not look like the little Pillsbury Doughboy. And God is not an old white man with a long gray beard that looks like Charlton Heston playing Moses. And Mary did not have pale skin, blonde hair, and blue eyes. Get over it. And do it now. You can make a difference if you choose to, you young people. How many of you have parents, mothers, who are really tired of sending Christmas cards? I'll tell you how to solve that problem. Go down to the store, buy a box of Christmas cards with the Holy Family picture on it. Take it home, color and write. When your mother sends those out this year, she'll never get another Christmas card from most of those people. People, we have to absolutely refuse to tolerate the intolerable. Elie Wiesel said, you must not tolerate the intolerable. And if it's intolerable for you, my cousins, then by the gods of war, it's intolerable for me, and I will not tolerate it. This has gone on long enough. This has gone on long enough. And we have gone along to get along long enough. We need to put a stop to it. And you can. Educators can. Educators can change this. If I can, you can. Get busy. But first,
this is a question that fits right with what you're saying. How can we talk about race and privilege with openness and inclusiveness in a way that prevents people from shutting down?
People can shut down or not, that's up to them.
Okay.
Let me tell you something. I am not responsible for how you respond to me. You got it? I flat out don't care. If you learn something in here this evening from this woman who has forgotten more than I'll ever know about racism. And what little I know, if you decide to learn something in here tonight, you'll learn something. If you decide to be mad, you'll be mad. Go ahead, I don't care. That's your problem, not mine. I'm not responsible for how you feel. I am responsible for what I say. I'm responsible for what I do. You're responsible for your response to it. Be responsible for your responses. I'm not responsible for it.
Okay, I want to hear what Angela has to say to this. Because,
Well, I totally agree with Jane.
okay.
How can I not?
Accept that.
But
But
as someone who has spent many years teaching university students, teaching graduate students, I've learned that it makes no sense for me to simply tell my students what it is I think they ought to know. You know, they might learn enough to write a good paper, and then they'll move on, moving in another direction. So I've come to the conclusion that teaching really is about helping people to ask the right questions, to ask the right questions, and to be able to come to the conclusion themselves that there is something really terribly wrong with the way racism has shaped the history of this planet. So I mean, I think education is about unleashing the imagination. What teachers, unfortunately, most often do is shut down the imagination and to prevent people from exploring the world in their own ways. And so I think that certainly there are many questions to be asked about race and racism, about the fact that race is a fictive concept. As Jane was pointing out, we're all members of the same human race. Race is a social construction. Race was produced by racism. But of course, this does not mean that it doesn't cause damage in the world, that it hasn't been the producer, the generator of the worst kind of violence one can imagine. But I think that that what we try to do is to get people to come to that conclusion on their own, and not on their own as individuals. See, one of the reasons we have so many problems in this country and in this world, particularly during this neoliberal era, is because we have been encouraged to think of ourselves as individuals primarily and not members of a larger community. You know, so when we think about getting rid of racism, we think about changing individuals. It's not going to happen simply by changing individuals. The structures produce racism even when the individuals assume that they are anti-racist. You know, how is it that we ended up with a prison system with such a vast majority of people of color? You know, how is it that there are over 2 million people in the jails and prisons and immigrant detention facilities and jails in Indian country and military prison? How did that happen? If we don't, you know, ask the kinds of questions that will allow us to understand how racism shapes all of the important institutional structures in this society, and that simply changing people's minds is going to solve the problem. I I mean, right now we're watching the trial of what is his name? Jason Van Dyke in Chicago. Laquan McDonald. You remember the killing of? I think the policeman's name is
I don't.
Jason Van Dyke. Is that right? Something
My
like
husband
that.
would know.
That's right. Okay, you checked it. You probably Googled it, huh? And no longer can we assume that simply by holding this individual police officer responsible for what was a horrendous murder, because we saw the tape, right, where he shot him. How many times? 14, 15, 16 times? 16 times.
16.
And even if someone like this police officer gets sentenced to prison for life, that's not going to change the police apparatus.
Right.
That's not going to make any substantive difference. And so we also have to learn how to think in terms of changing these institutions and these repressive apparatuses. And this is why we need to see ourselves as a part of a community of struggle, a community of resistance, of people who are like-minded and who are committed to engaging in the struggle against racism and all of the related oppressions over decades and perhaps even over centuries. Because
Okay.
I don't know how long it's going to take to purge this world of racism.
Okay, so people came to hear you, and you have issued a call, both of you, that things do need to change. You're talking about systemic change and changing minds. What are 3 things that each person can do
Chris,
as individuals,
we're going to
work communities,
we're going to
and the
we're
understanding
terminate the program right now.
and its role in
Dialogue.
social justice issues?
Yes, that interesting dialogue. Kate Elliott, Angela Davis coming up with a lot of information that's very important for us to know. One thing we have to do is to think through this thing ourselves. Some things are very, very basic. Kate Elliott indicated to you that mankind began in Africa. Most modern day scientists conclude that. And when the term Aborigine is used, and it's used when it relates to American Indians, it's used when it relates to indigenous people in Australia. Aborigine means first people. You understand that? Aborigine means first. But your first people didn't necessarily begin where they are. They were just the first people that were there. You understand what I'm saying? Native Americans may have been the first one that was there, but they came there from Africa, Europe. First people of Southern Europe were the Grimaldi people, small pygmy-like people, black people. The first people in India were the Dravidians, and they were black. The Aryans came later. The first people in Australia, Tasmania, New Zealand were black. The first people were black. Now, and they have a history. And if you look at the development of civilization, you can't single out one race of people and say that they were not civilized, because great civilizations began in Africa. The richest man in the world, according to scientists and modern day scientists, was a man by the name of Max Muth. And all the Bill Gates and all the folks that exist today that happen to be wealthy don't compare to him. Racism has not ended. Racism is here And my way of thinking is here to stay. So we have to learn how to adapt. We have to learn how to deal with it and to fight what I call systemic racism. In other words, racism is the way things are done. And if you're not careful, you can be Black and you can also be racist. You're saying Black, you can't be racist. That's a lie. You can be racist. If you buy in to systemic discrimination against your own, then you are indeed carrying out racism. Racism is not so much a person, but a methodology in doing things. So we've got to come up with a whole system, a whole new system to try to at least distort, minimize racism. And it's not always against African Americans. Anybody that's different can be discriminated against. You know what I'm saying? There's hate going around in this country against what they call yellow people or what you call or Asiatic. Trying to blame them for this darn virus that's going around. Anything that happens is negative. They try to find somebody else to blame it. And this may sound philosophical, it may sound crazy, but somehow we have to inject into our education an element of love and unity. Now, I know I may sound like a preacher, but I'll say it and I'll say it again. No matter whether you're Caucasian and you're Ireland or you're Irish or you're Swedish or you're English, somehow we got to respect who we are, not feel bad about who we are, and respect the other person. It's just, and to come together based on those things that we have in common. And I want to say one thing that I totally agree with Minister Farrakhan. We can't look for the person that created the problem to solve. If there's a problem with poor housing, a problem with education, a problem with jobs, whatever it is, Mark Twain will say, I myself am heaven and am hell. I look for that inverted bowl they call the sky where other coop we live and die. Work and believe in yourself. And you know why? Remember that. Work and believe in yourself. We are still in Lebanon Valley Farmers Market. Know how long we're gonna be there, to be honest with you. Currently, we're there and we still have pictures and artifacts and oils and African clothing. It comes and goes because we do sell some things. These are some pictures that we have. You see the clothing, you see the soapstone statues, giraffes. You got other giraffes. We hope we have some. And soon, come see us. Do we need your support? I believe we need your support. Do we want it? Yes, and we just like to see it too. So come and visit us. Visit us. And they got some new vendors, that have moved into the market. We got more diversity. The new ownership of the market has seen to bring in people. We got several new African American vendors that are there. Selling different kinds of food. Some good old soul food, fried fish, and collard greens, potato salad, mac and cheese. You can get that down there. There's a lot of things that are going on there, and there's some wonderful people that will serve you and treat you with respect and dignity. Lebanon Valley Farmers Market. I just heard some news, and I should have known it happened over a year ago. a dear friend of mine by the name of Eugene Smith passed. I want to offer my much belated condolences. I've been trying to get in touch with him. Nobody told me that he passed. He was one of my closest friends. Eugene Smith started an event called Legend, Lives, and Lovers. And that's when African American men over the age of 50 would come together and interact and try to create some degree of unity. The thing Farrakhan did, Gene was working on the same thing on a local level, trying to. I had no better friend in this world than Gene. And also, I got to offer my condolences, and he's been gone a couple of years now, John Manical, or alias Joe Smooth. These were people that supported me, that protected me when I was really out there campaigning for human rights. And I want to say, God bless you all. Much love to you and your family for having such a wonderful neighbor and a friend. Well, we just passed this way once, and then we go on to glory. And I've been getting out a lot more than I have been. I'm still disabled, not able to walk without a stroller. But somehow, with the help of others, I'm able to get out there, and I've been bending and going to different events, wonderful things that were put on in terms of Black history and other kinds of events, by the Gaskins and Kwanzaa. It's been wonderful. The NAACP in Lebanon throwing a wonderful Juneteenth program that I participated in, played drums and spoke. So, hey, we getting out there with Joan, we're still alive and kicking. Okay, now you mentioned it on July 4th. Dale Wise and Mississippi are going to be on our show, singing the blues, the original, authentic blues. That's Dale Wise, Dale's Drum Shop. We're in Colonial Park. You ought to go pay Dale a visit. Okay, God bless you, and may heaven smile upon you and be gracious unto thee. Bless you. And so long until we see you next week. This is Richard James signing off. Take care.
Thank you again for tuning in to the Richard James Show. Our African and our African American programs are set up to educate you on what's going on in this world. We thank you for taking out the time to listen. Let us hear from you sometime also. So this is your neighbor and your friend signing off. Until I see you again next week, and hear from you again next week. So long. God bless.